Anybody have any idea what's in this screen that I'm standing in front of?
Compressors?
Compressors. Anthony's right to an extent. There's definitely some compressors in there.
Plugins.
What's that, Lauren?
Plugins.
Plugins. Lots and lots and lots of plugins, and those are the GUI, meaning the graphical user interface of the plugins. And there's lots of them. Plugins that many of us know in the digital world equate to signal processors that we've been using for over 50 years in sound. Big old processors in racks. So this particular week, we're covering an overview today of signal processing. It's really cool because there's so much you can do with signal processing. That's what I'm so excited to teach you about. And we'll cover EQ, equalization, which is the most commonly used signal processor among everyone who hears audio, even the end user who has maybe a 10-band graphic EQ through Apple's iMusic, or you have a car stereo that has EQ, or a home stereo that has a treble and a bass knob. That's EQ, really. It's quite, it does a very clunky way of equalizing sound because it's huge groups of frequency. And so we're going to learn a lot about how an audio engineer or anyone tinkering in audio can actually go into single groups of frequencies, really narrow groups, narrow bandwidth of frequencies to make changes, which is really amazing. Okay, so I want to get to the overview, which actually I'm going to share my screen to go over this week and Canvas, and then go into the lecture that's in Canvas so I can just use it to show you some of the terminology. By the way, will somebody remind me to show you the Splashtop reservation sheet? I know it's for your lab classes, but I want to be sure you all know there's another class that starts this week that's going to start using a few of the computers in here. So I just want to go through that with you guys. So someone remind me, because I want to stick with this for a moment. Here we are, week 7, signal processing. Quick link that I try to put in, I try to remember every time. And this is just the audio spectrum. So one of the frequency types in an overview type is called spectrum processors. And spectrum processors have to do with the frequency spectrum. So the EQ is a big part of that. But there's also some other things in spectrum processing, which I'm going to go through in a moment. And then there's other types of processors too. So that gets me to the overview. If you take a look at this page, and this is just all in Canvas, a processor modifies a signal. It changes a signal in some way. It enhances it. It can increase amplitude to certain frequencies like an EQ, or decrease amplitude to frequencies. So you can see under frequency spectrum processors, you've got an EQ, filters, which is something we're going to be covering as part of the EQ lecture, a de-esser. Can anyone imagine what a de-esser is? The sibilance, the sound of an S is really horrible when you start to apply a compressor to a vocal track. It makes things more SC. So there's a device called a de-esser, it's a frequency processor that removes some of the hissiness, which is way up in the 6K, 8K range. There's pitch as part of a frequency spectrum processor, modulation, and distortion. Even though it's considered a noise processor, it's also part of frequency spectrum because you're doing some things to the frequency spectrum when you add distortion. Okay, another overview type, amplitude processors. They're also known as dynamics processors. Everyone remembers what dynamic range means? Quietest to the loudest signal. It has to do with amplitude, which is why they're in the same grouping here. So the quietest to loudest. And what a dynamics processor does is change the dynamic range. So a compressor is what we're going to start getting into next week. Another amplitude processor is a limiter, a ducker, and a gate. Compressors take large changes in volume, drastic changes. If I were to yell and then I was going to get really quiet, then yell again. Imagine TV shows you watch, or films that you might see. There's always scenes where people are screaming and then they're getting really quiet. People sing like that too in certain bands where that's just the way the lead singer is going to sing a particular song. But when we're listening to that song later, we miss all the quiet parts if we're blasted by the loud parts because we're trying to turn things down. Oh, it's getting too loud. So what a compressor does is it lowers the loudness, getting it more equal to the quiet part, and then brings them both up together with another output knob, which we're going to discuss when we talk about compression. So compressors actually change the dynamic range and make it more narrow so that we can hear everything more equally.